I guess, day 5 of this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and reports through the night that Kharkiv, the second biggest city in Ukraine, was shelled in civilian areas. In fact, our own Jack Crosby got, I guess, left Kharkiv just before the shelling began. He was on Chris Hayes's program last night, reporting from some distance that they had moved west. And my understanding, and we'll talk to Matt Duss a little bit about this, obviously a lot about this, but my understanding is that after Kharkiv, they will go south to another city and then make their way up to Kyiv, meeting, Belarusian forces. But it's
north,
unclear as to, where things stand in Kharkiv. Kharkiv was supposed to fall much quicker because at least people presume the assumption by Putin was that it would fall much quicker because it is closer, it is further to the east. It is more, I guess, ethnically, language-wise, more Russian speaking. I think it's the second. I think it's the largest Russian-speaking city in the country, and there was obviously a miscalculation by Putin's government. I've been trying to articulate this the past couple of days. Well, I guess just yesterday when I was on, but I was I mean, I've been trying to articulate this, and Duncan Black at Atrios at Eschaton wrote this up, and this is really important because I think very broad strokes, what has happened is people did not expect, ultimately, I think largely, there to be an invasion. Although, again, one never knows what other players are thinking. But largely, I don't think the Ukrainians thought there was. I mean, the American government certainly seemed to believe that there was going to be an invasion. Or at least they were posturing in that way. We don't know if they were posturing in that way as a way of trying to inhibit an invasion. But Putin clearly had some assumptions about how quickly and how easily this thing would take place, and they were wrong. The Russians have not dedicated nearly their full arsenal, even that they had amassed on the Ukrainian border, and they're starting to do that, and people are very worried about that. But I don't think anybody, including the Russians, or maybe even the Americans, for that matter, anticipated the blowback. There are 2 oligarchs, apparently, that are speaking out. There are people in the government that are speaking out. There are protests across Russia. There has been widespread in the West condemnation.
Now China appears to be turning.
There's like, I think there's... Well,
coyness is there's a crack in it a bit. They're talking to the Ukrainian authorities.
Exactly. And at the very least, I think it's safe to say that there has been a more of a blowback than one could possibly anticipate, particularly if you remember what happened in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. There just was nothing that amounted to this. And while I think that's a good thing, it does scare me insofar as that the ghouls who live amongst us in this country, in NATO, in other places, may seize upon this opportunity as a way of getting Putin out. Let me just read what Atrio said, and then we'll get into this, because this is about a clip that we have. Atrio says, de-escalation is a desirable goal, largely and separate from any concept of who is right and who is wrong. And the sad thing is that our politicians, puts an asterisk there, are largely just like us in that they're getting amped up on war fever and Twitter memes. We all want to crush the guy who deserves to be crushed, but getting through this with minimal loss of life should be the priority, not indulging in righteous rage. He writes, I am dumb and not in charge of anything. It is rare that I have any influence on the world at all, but the voices suggesting that anything other than maximum humiliation of Putin and regime change is unacceptable are growing louder. Hey, maybe they're right, but maybe they are catastrophically wrong.
And I'd add, just as an addendum, the calls for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, also disastrous.
This is all part of that same thing.
Yeah.
And he says, the asterisk, it seems the Biden people are pretty good, at least so far. Some Dems are not, and Republicans are switching from Putin is good to Putin is history's greatest monster is not actually helpful. Many UK politicians are far dumber and crueler than our own. Hard to believe, but very true. The point being that there is one thing to, posture to avoid a war. And then what happens is when they see that Putin is actually going to pay a major price for this.
He's a wounded animal in their eyes.
He is a wounded animal. But what the idea is at that point is, how do you wound him more at this point?
It's time for the kill shot, some of these ghouls are thinking.
But who will be the bullet? Here is Hillary Clinton on Rachel Maddow Show. Believe me, I wouldn't necessarily give a limb, but I'd give a lot to not have to discuss Hillary Clinton, regardless of what your feelings were as to the election, et cetera, et cetera. I was very upset that Michael Dukakis lost. But I did not, want to watch him 5 or 6 years later, opining on these type of things. Here is Hillary Clinton on Rachel Maddow Show, and I'll tell you what is really, really disturbing about this. Play the clip.
But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980. And although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight.
1 second. So just for those of you who are younger and don't know the history, when she says a lot of countries, really, basically, it's the United States. I mean, it may be our allies. They're doing it at our behest and et cetera, et cetera. But we armed the Mujahideen. We actually paid for the madrasas in Pakistan to develop the Taliban.
Isn't there a movie starring Tom Hanks about this?
Yes, Charlie Wilson's War.
Brave Mujahideen fighters.
And also, this is how bin Laden grows.
Yes.
And
so her use of the passive voice is doing a lot there.
Exactly. Exactly. But her point being that it severely damaged the Soviet Union. So just keep that in mind. This is the mode of thought that is going on here, that sucking them into a quagmire may actually debilitate the existing government. This is what she is articulating here.
Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know. But the fact is that a very motivated
what were the unintended consequences? Can you imagine if
leave that all unsaid? Shall we?
She's just not going to say the word 9 and then afterwards 11.
Right.
I mean,
there's a little bit of blowback, and of course the destruction of the country and the Taliban taking over. That was not the
occupation after that for 20 years.
But put that aside. And why does she want to put that aside? Because she's making a very specific point. If you draw them in, maybe this becomes a quagmire that ends up destroying the country. That's the point she's trying to make here.
funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on, because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward. And if there can be sufficient armaments that get in, and they should be able to get in along some of the borders between other nations and Ukraine, and keep the Ukrainian, both their military and their citizen volunteer soldiers supplied, that can continue to stymie Russia. Now, let's be clear that Russia has overwhelming military force. But of course, they did in Afghanistan as well. They also brought a lot of air power to Syria. It took years to finally defeat Syria in terms of the insurgencies, the democratic forces, as well as others who battled the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians. So if you're fighting for your homeland, you're fighting for your family, you're fighting for your ideals, that's far more powerful than sending in these poor.
All right. Couple of things. First on, yeah, you can't bank on this, because there's a reason why they called Afghanistan the graveyard of empires.
Yeah.
They don't call that in Ukraine because of all those differences about Afghanistan. But do not misunderstand what she's saying here. There is an option that she could be saying here. She could be saying, the key is, if there is enough resistance, maybe we can find an off-ramp for Putin so that we can save people's lives. And that is, she could be pushing that, but she's not. What she's saying is, maybe if we arm Ukraine enough, it will create a quagmire. Now, granted,
there are unintended consequences.
There's unintended consequences, and the Russian military has overwhelming force. But maybe this could be a protracted, years-long thing where they will be stymied, and we will see a redo of what happened to the Soviet Union happen with Russia. And when she is talking about, when Emma says, the kill shot is available, understand what she's saying here. The bullet are Ukrainians.
Yeah, and it's a country of 44 million people that she's kind of like toying around in her mind with as being a ground for a proxy battle, and which in her ideal world and in the people that think like her ends in Putin's power being greatly diminished.
And listen,
which is psychotic.
If I could press a button right now and Vladimir Putin was ejected into the stratosphere, I would do it without hesitation. But the bottom line is, and the reason why I read that paragraph from Atrios, is that we should be looking at de-escalation not because have any truck for Putin, but because you want to save human lives.
Not turn them into, sign them up for 10 years of guerrilla warfare.
Exactly.
And with the end, being as clean as she's anticipating that it will be, or she's claiming that it will be, even though she talked about how, it didn't work out so well in Afghanistan, but it might work this time. Just a little bit different.
I mean, the bottom line is just the idea that you're going to you're encouraging Ukraine to turn into a years-long insurgency for the sake, and using the example again,
right?
Using the example of Afghanistan, because aside from the unintended consequences that she sort of brushes away, the Taliban, 9/11, 20-year war, this and that, the only thing that really happened there, besides the death and destruction of many Afghans and the destruction of Afghanistan, was that it led to the demise of the Soviet Union. So what she's talking about is this is regime change without us really having to do that much. And by us, she means us sitting here in a studio, not the us of the people living in Kyiv or Kharkiv or anywhere in Ukraine.
And this is her way. I mean, like, let's be clear, too, when she goes on Maddow's show to talk about this, when she says this is something people are considering, what do you think that her designs are here? It's to pressure the Biden administration publicly to get more involved.
Without a doubt.
So just I mean, that's why she's on Maddow's show.
Bad. That's my comment.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, bad. I think bad is accurate. We should say, we had mentioned that we were going to talk about this briefly. There's no update on the drone strike in Somalia. The U.S. military has said that there's probably no civilian casualties.
Oh, well, good.
So that's good.
I mean, that's something I think we need to pay attention to on the left right now. Is The Intercept's done some good reporting on it, but it's sparse because the information coming out of not just Somalia, but broader Eastern Africa and our operations there, it's completely opaque and deliberately so. So like when we were having a larger question about, or a larger conversation about war and what that means, this is a reminder that we're still engaged throughout the globe in places like Somalia. And we have zero concept, at least it's not really reported on much in the Western press, of what those consequences are.